Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for another webinar in our Market Access and International Approvals webinar series. My name is Crystal and I am part of the Testing and Certification technical staff here at Vista Compliance Laboratories. Today we will be presenting to you the certification and approval regulations as well as the technical requirements for electrical equipment, electronics, and wireless products and device approval in Africa. As an EMC RF compliance test lab and certification body, we focus on wireless and RF devices approval. So today we will primarily be going over the requirements of a couple countries in Africa. This includes the most populous countries of Africa along with an in-depth overview of South Africa. So if you aren't aware of what we do at Vista Laboratories, we are an EMC RF compliance test lab and product certification body, and we are experts in global regulatory approvals for radio frequency devices. So today we'll be going over the requirements of radio frequency and telecommunication approval in Africa. In this webinar, we will provide an overview of the major topics necessary to get your radio devices on the right track for authorization and distribution in Africa. If you have any questions on the topic presented today or any other immediate questions regarding compliance testing and product certification, you can reach us at info@vista-compliance.com. Now let's begin with the presentation. Here's a list of fully recognized and sovereign states that are members of the United Nations and African Union, starting from the top left corner, going down and to the right: Algeria, Angola, Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, Cabo Verde, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, Democratic Republic of Congo, Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Eswatini, Ethiopia, Gabon, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Libya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe, Senegal, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, South Sudan, Tanzania, Togo, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. What is ARPCE? The Algeria Regulatory Authority of the Post and Electronic Communications, ARPCE, regulates the radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Algeria. The Regulatory Authority of Post and Telecommunication regulates Algeria's post, broadcasting, and telecommunications. The ARPT was responsible for granting operating permits, giving recommendations to producers, managing the radio frequency spectrum, ensuring fair competition, improving technology and equipment, and protecting consumers. As of 2018, ARPT was split. The spectrum management was given to ANF, while the remaining authority was renamed ARPCE. This new title was to reflect the regulatory's expanding involvement in all aspects of today's ever-evolving digital communications industry and field. They are responsible as the independent regulatory authority overseeing RF and telecom type approvals, issuing certificates for radio and telecom, and can issue RF and EMC certifications. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Algeria type approval. Documentation. All sealed and signed documents must be legibly written in either Arabic, French, or English. CE technical files or FCC submission files will include data sheets, external and internal photos, block diagrams, DOC or TCs, user manuals, test reports, EMC, radio safety, testing. In-country testing is required. 1 times normal sample is required. Local representative has to be the actual importer. Lead time is device dependent. 8 to 12 weeks on average. Validity, 3 years. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, CE is accepted. Some additional information to take into consideration. On the administrative part of type approval, other included documents that you will need to gain approval will be for the applicant to complete annexes 02, 03, and 04. This needs to be dated sealed with mention of the company's name and duly signed by the legal representative of the legal entity or its agent in accordance with model provided for in Annex 05. Copy of the commercial registered containing the activity codes linked to the manufacturer, import, and marketing of terminal equipment or radio installation falling within the jurisdiction of the regulatory authority within the means of Law Number 18-04 of May 2018. Copy of tax registration card. Copy of the certificate of existence of the tax registration card for foreign companies operating in Algeria. Company statuses. Company of the activity approval for operators operating in the fields of sensitive equipment Type 1 and Type 2 in accordance with Executive Decree Number 09-410 of December 10, 2009, proof of payment of file management fees in the amount of 7,140 dinars, including tax for the benefit of the Post and Electronic Communications Regulatory Authority, ARPCE, Bank, CPA Agency de Houston Day Number 0040118401000469540. The applicant for approval must pay fixed, non-refundable file management fees. The approval fees provided for by the decision number 12/PC/ARPT/12 of 04/16/2012 will be paid upon withdrawal of the Certificate of Conformity or Notification of Refusal. On the technical part, Declaration of Conformity, originally drawn up by the manufacturer or its duly authorized representative or signed electronical signed declarations of conformity must be sent to the following email address: hmg@arpce.dz. Certificate of Origin issued by the authorized body. Certificate of Conformity supported by conformity test reports from an accredited laboratory in terms of electrical safety, electromagnetic compatibility, radio spectrum specific absorption rate, SAR, or exposure to electromagnetic radiation. Accreditation that is evidenced by the documents issued by the accreditation body of the country of the testing laboratory. For test reports that are more than 3 years old, a declaration of manufacturing continuity of the terminal equipment established by the manufacturer or its duly authorized representative is required in the approval application file. The approval application file must be provided in paper and digital form, with the exception of test reports, which must be provided only in digital format. Here is a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment, type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category and model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid for 3 years. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. What is ARPTIC? ARPTIC regulates radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This year, in February 2023, the authorities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, has approved of the creation of a new regulating body known as the ARPTIC. ARPTIC is the acronym for the Regulatory Authority for Post, Telecommunications and Information and Communications Technologies. which will take over the previous regulator, ARPTC, which has supervised the telecommunications sector since 2002. Independent regulatory authority oversees RF and telecom type approval along with issuing technical standards. Issues certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Here's an overview for ARPTIC type approval, documentation, CE technical files, data sheets, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manuals, test reports, EMC, radio safety, local representation, mandatory. Testing, in-country testing is required, no sample is required. Local representative required, lead time 5 weeks, more depending on the complexity of the product, validity 2, 3, or 5 years. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, minimum height 3 millimeters. Sticker can be on the user manual if the product is small. Here is some extra information to keep in mind. For type approvals, for any radio module, the validity is 2 years. For equipment such as printers, computers, tablets, and car radios, the validity is 3 years. For devices connected to public networks, the validity is 5 years. As of 2020, marking requirements include approval number and date, identification of the model and batch or serial number, and manufacturer or supply identification. Also added in 2020 was the CIF value added to all equipment subject to approval in the DRC. This tax was 5% of the cost or the CIF value of the equipment and is added to the cost of the product approval. For label information, there isn't a specific label requirement. The CE marking is sufficient, but there must be a shown sticker with all the relevant information about the product. The sticker must be bought by the importer from the authority. In addition to this, there are importation considerations that must also be considered, such as customs clearance, labeling, packaging regulations, and other import-related procedures. Here's a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category and model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid for 2, 3, or 5 years. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. What is NTRA? The National Telecom Regulatory Authority, NTRA, regulates radio frequency and the standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Egypt. Independent regulatory authority oversees RF and telecom type approvals. Issues certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Here's an overview of Egypt type approvals. Documentation, CE technical files, data sheet, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manual, test reports, EMC, radio, safety. Schemes, light scheme, tight scheme, guided scheme, intermediate scheme. Testing, in-country testing is not required. A sample is required. Local representative, not required. Lead time, 3 weeks depending on device. Validity, permanent. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, not applicable. We can expect frequent delays for Egypt, and we are able and willing to help you navigate those problems in a timely and efficient manner. A more in-depth explanation of the schemes, which have different applicable requirements that may differ depending on the applicant's manufacturer's country of origin. These are the 4 categories of approval depending on the country's origin. Light schemes for applicants and manufacturers from Western Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, or the US. Tight schemes for applicants and manufacturers from China or India. Guided schemes. For applicants and manufacturers from Egypt. Intermediate scheme. For applicants and manufacturers from any country that has not specifically listed in previous schemes. Testing requirements will be stricter for the type schemes in terms of laboratory recognitions. Every scheme requires the ISO 9001 certificate or similar to be present as part of the technical file. However, the guided scheme will require a factory inspection in order to get type approval. Here is a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval numbers and certificate number, client's information, equipment category and model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval numbers must be shown on label. What is ECA? The Ethiopian Communication Authority regulates radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Ethiopia. Independent regulatory authority oversees RF and telecom type approval, also covers the Postal Service. Issues certificate for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Pursuant to Article 6, parentheses 7, parentheses, of Communications Service Proclamation Number 1148/2019 Proclamation, the Ethiopian Communications Authority, ECA, has power and duties to license and supervise operators of communication services and modify and renew, suspend, or revoke licenses. In accordance to Article 20, Sub-Article 1 and 2, no person may operate a communication service without obtaining a license from the authority. The authority shall issue licenses for the operation and provision of communication services by way of class or individual licenses on such terms and conditions as the authority may from time to time determine, including the term of the license. As per Telecommunication License Directive Number 792/2021, Appendices A to C, the authority issues the following individual and class licenses: Unified Telecommunications Services License, Internet Exchange Point IXP License, Class License including Internet Service Provider License, Data Center Service Provider License, Hosting Service Provider License, Call Center Service License, Telecommunications Value Added Service License, Virtual Internet Service Providers VISP License, Very Small Aperture Terminal VSAT License, Global Mobile Personal Communications by Satellite GMPCS Landing Rights Authorization, Private Networks and Closed User Group CUG Authorization, Satellite News Gathering SNG License, Indoor Telecommunications Facilities Installation and Maintenance Work License, Outdoor Telecommunications Facilities Installation and Maintenance Work License. No person shall operate a telecommunication service or network without obtaining a license or having been granted a license exempt from the authority consistent with the Proclamation and Telecommunication Licensing Directive Number 792/2021. No person shall use the radio frequency spectrum without obtaining a license from the authority consistent with the Proclamation and Telecommunication Licensing Directive Number 792/2021 except for ISM bands in 2.4 and 5G that will be used for Wi-Fi, RFID, and other low-power short-range devices and services which are unlicensed. The Telecommunication Authority for Ethiopia is for granting regulatory type approvals covering products under multiple categories. These categories cover telecommunications, wireless radio, short-range devices, and IoT devices. Here's an overview of Ethiopia's type approval. Documents, technical files, data sheet, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manual, test reports, EMC, radio, safety, testing. In-country testing is not required. Local representative, required. Lead time, 3 weeks. Validity, 2 years. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, not applicable. ECA accepts both the American FCC standard for the certification process, but also the European EU ITSE standard. The certificates are valid for 2 years, but can be renewed shortly before they expire. Here's a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category, /model, models, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid for 2 years. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. In the picture is an example of an MCIT type approval certificate. On the top center of the certificate is the radio equipment type approval number, which must be shown on the label. This is the part that says TA-year/certificate number. Information shown on the certificate includes the applicant's name, address, telephone number, and registration number, and the description of the device. The description of the device includes the category and model, and if applicable, the frequency range, ITU, emission code, modulation, power output, channel spacing, and features. What is CA? The Communications Authority of Kenya regulates radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Kenya. Independent regulatory authority oversees RF and telecom type approval, along with licensing all of the communications industry. Issues certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. It is also enforced compliance in the country. The Communications Authority of Kenya, CA, is the regulatory authority for the communication sector in Kenya. It was established in 1999 by the Kenya Information and Communications Act of 1998. The authority is responsible for facilitating the development of the information and communication sectors, including broadcasting, cybersecurity, multimedia, telecommunications, electronic commerce, postal and courier services. CA's responsibilities include licensing all systems and services in the communications industry, including telecommunications, postal, courier, and broadcasting, managing the country's frequency spectrum and numbering resources, facilitating the development and management of national cybersecurity framework, facilitating the development of e-commerce, type approving and accepting communications equipment meant for use in the country, protecting consumer rights within the communications environment, managing competition within the sector to ensure a level playing ground for all players, regulating retail and wholesale tariffs for communications services, managing the Universal Access Fund to facilitate access to communication services by all in Kenya, monitoring the activities of licensees to enforce compliance with the license terms and conditions as well as the law. Here's an overview of Kenya's type approval. Documentation, technical files should be in English, data sheet, external and internal, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manual, test reports, EMC, radio, safety, letter of agency from manufacturer or distributor, technical operational manual, certified copies of DOC issued by equipment manufacturer or accredited laboratory, testing, in-country testing may be required, one-time snorkel sample, local representative required, lead time 5 to 8 weeks, depending on the complexity of your device, validity 6 months, 1 year, or limited, compliance mandatory, labeling CE/FCC accepted. CA adopts the international standards whenever possible in the hopes of eliminating technical standards that would bar international trade. As a result, the CA recognizes standards from the following international bodies: ANSI, American National Standards, CENELEC, European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization, CISPR, International Special Committee for Radio Interference, IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, ITU, International Telecommunications Union, ITSI, European Telecommunications Standard Institute, ATEX, Explosive Atmospheres Directive. Please note that the authority is not obliged to return equipment that has been submitted for type approval purposes, as some tests can be destructive. Test reports and test laboratories need to show evidence of accreditation to ISO IEC 17025 from an accreditation body that is signatory of ILAC should be provided. All type approval fees are non-refundable, and the authority does not accept cash payments for type approval applications. Please use mobile money or bank transfers. Licensees must produce a suitable certificate of type approval or display relevant markings for the equipment to be used upon request by an authorized representative for CA. The point of contact. Please note that CA prefers to communicate electronically. Please provide email address whenever possible. Note that the licensee can opt out of email correspondence in the declaration section. All other contacts whose emails are provided will receive communications electronically. Validity period for conformity documents can be limited, exception letters, or limited to 6 months. Certificates of conformity, after which the authority issues an unlimited certificate automatically. There are no additional requirements for product labeling. Here is a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category, model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid for 6 months to 1 year, or indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. The picture is an example of a CA type approval certificate. On the top center of the certificate is a radio equipment type approval number, which must be shown on the label. This is the part that says TA-year/certificate number. Information shown on the certificate includes the applicant's name, address, telephone number, and registration number, and the description of the device. The description of the device includes the category and model, and if applicable, the frequency range, ITU, emission code, modulation, power output, channel spacing, and features. What is NCC? The Nigerian Communication Commission's NCC regulates radio frequency and the standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Nigeria. Independent regulatory authorities oversee RF and telecom type approvals, issues certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Facilitates importation of communication equipment, along with creating regulations for telecommunication products. The NCC's goal is to ensure maximum interoperability and affordability for consumers. The type approval standards by the NCC are based on the international standards from IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, CISPR, International Special Committee on Radio Interference, CENELEC, the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization, and ITSI, the European Telecommunication Standards Institute. Please note that Nigeria is an associate member of IEC through the Standardized Organization of Nigeria, SUN, and could become an associate member of CENELEC and ITSI. Here's a quick overview of Nigeria's type approval: documentation, CE technical files, datasheet, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC and TEC, user manual, test reports, EMC, radio, and safety. Testing. In-country testing is required. One-time neural sample is required. Local representative, not required. Lead time, 8 weeks, depending on the complexity of your device. Validity, life. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling. Type approvals applications through the email are not accepted. The current policy for now is to only review applications that come through the Office of Executive Vice Chairman. Also, Note that NCC does not return equipment samples. A certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category, model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. The picture on the left is an example of an NCC type approval certificate. On the top center of the certificate is the radio equipment type approval number, which must be shown on the label. This is the part that says TA-year/certificate number. Information shown on the certificate includes the applicant's name, address, telephone number, and registration number, and the description of the device. The description of the device includes the category and model, and if applicable, the frequency range, ITU, emission code, modulation, power output, channel spacing, and other features. What is NCA? The National Communications Authority regulates radio frequency and the standardization of radio and telecom equipment in South Sudan. Independent Regulatory Authority oversees RF and telecom type approval, issues certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulates products to be sold in or imported into the country. South Sudan type approval. Documentation can be either CE technical files or FCC submission files. Some documents that they share: data sheets, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manuals, and test reports, EMC, radio, and safety. Testing. In-country testing is required. 1 times normal sample is required. Local representative required. Lead time, 7 weeks, depending on the complexity of your device. Validity, permanent. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, CE mark. NCA's conformity assessment system is based on both European, EU, and American FCC standards, which contributes to smooth market access. Conformity assessments in South Sudan does not require local laboratory testing of the product. The unlimited validity period, which minimizes efforts of the manufacturer, is obtaining a certificate of conformity. Products must be labeled with the CE mark. Here's a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval numbers and certificate numbers, client information, equipment category, model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. In the picture is an example of an NCA type approval certificate. On the top of the certificate is the radio equipment type approval number, which must be shown on the label. This is the part that says TA-year/certificate number. Information shown on the certificate includes the applicant's name, address, telephone number, and registration number, and the description of the device. The description of the device includes the category and model, and if applicable, the frequency range, ITU emission code, modulation, power output, channel spacing, and other features. What is TCRA? The Tanzania Communication Regulation Authority regulates the radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Tanzania. Independent Regulatory Authority oversees RF and telecom type approvals, issuing certificates for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Here's an overview of Tanzania's type approval. Documentation, CE technical files, data sheet, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manual, operational manual, test reports, EMC, radio, and safety. Testing. In-country testing is required. 1 times normal sample is required. Local representative, not required. Lead time, 4 weeks, depending on complexity of your device. Validity, permanent. Compliance, mandatory. Labeling, not required. CE/FCC labels are accepted as well. Validity is for an unlimited period of time provided no modifications have been made to the approved equipment. Whenever an existing type-approved electronic communications equipment is modified with respect to manufacturing brand name, product name, model number, or function, or any changes that affects any of the information recorded in the type approval register or the type approval certificate, a new application for type approval must be made to the requirements of these guidelines. Whenever changes to the type-approved electronic communications equipment may affect compliance with the applied standards and requirements to which it has been previously tested and validated, a new application for type approval must be made according to the requirements of these guidelines. Whenever changes to the type-approved electronic communications equipment may affect a network interface or have an effect on the specific essential requirements relating to safety, EMC, or radio frequency behavior of the concerning electric communications equipment, a new application for type approval must be made according to these requirements. If the changes to type-approved electronic communications equipment are essentially cosmetic and are non-network affecting or have no effect on the specific essential requirements relating to safety, EMC, or radio frequency behavior, a new application for type approval is not required provided that the information recorded in the type approval register remains unchanged. Here is a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval numbers and certificate number, client's information, equipment category, model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval numbers must be shown on label. What is UCC? The Uganda Communications Commission regulates radio frequency and standardization of radio and telecom equipment in Uganda. Independent regulatory authority oversees RF and telecom type approvals. Issues certificate for radio and telecom, can issue RF and EMC certification. A certificate of approval is required for radio equipment and regulated products to be sold in or imported into the country. Here's a quick overview of Uganda's type approval, documentation, technical files, data sheet, external and internal photos, block diagram, DOC, TEC, user manuals, test, reports, EMC, radio, safety, testing, in-country testing is not required. Local representative, not required. Lead time, 8 weeks. Depending on the complexity of your device. Validity, permanent, compliance, mandatory. Labeling, no special labels. English is the official language of communications for all type approval applications. Standards for which UCC type accepts equipment which is considered to be applicable in Uganda are ITU, FCC, EU, Canada, and European standards. Here's a certificate example. Certificate information and equipment records are publicly available and searchable. The following information will be shown: radio equipment type approval number and certificate number, client's information, equipment category, model, power and frequency information. Certificates are valid indefinitely. Radio equipment type approval number must be shown on label. This is an example of a UCC type approval certificate. On the top of the certificate is a radio equipment type approval number which must be shown on the label. This is the part of that says TA-year/certificate number. Information shown on the certificate includes the applicant's name, address, telephone number, and registration number, and the description of the device. The description of the device includes the category and model, and if applicable, the frequency range, ITU, emission code, modulation, power output, channel spacing, and other features. So starting with a brief overview, what is ICASA? ICASA, or Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, regulates radio frequency and the standardization of radio and telecom equipment in South Africa. Any equipment used or to be used with the provision of electronic communications must have an ICASA type approval certificate. ICASA is an independent regulatory authority and oversees radio frequency and telecom type approvals within the country. They issue certificates for both radio and telecom approval. Even though there is a South African regulatory body specifically for EMC, ICASA certificates can cover both radio frequency and EMC. ICASA and the EMC regulatory body SABS have an agreement in which ICASA can certify for EMC as well. In-country type approval testing is not required for ICASA certification, but most of the standards are based on international European standards. All post and telecommunications equipment, including radio modules and host devices capable of radio communications, are subject to South African ICASA approval, and it is mandatory for every wireless or telecom device that's produced, assembled, used, or traded within the South African territory to comply with the technical requirements based on the applicable regulations. A certificate of type approval is required for radio equipment and other regulated devices to be sold in or imported into South Africa. The ICASA approval methods. Here's a quick diagram of the ICASA approval methods. At the top, we have documentation technical review, and that splits off to standard and simplified. The main approval methods for type approval is this documentation technical review. Testing in country is not required, so most applicants go with the paperwork only process. The two processes for this are the standard and the simplified type approval processes. The type approval certificate will only be issued to South African registered companies, but they do not need to act as the final importer of the product. ICASA relies heavily on EU regulations and requests EU documentation to support the type approval applications. This could include the EU Declaration of Conformity and test reports. Test reports should be issued by accredited test labs defined in Type Approval Regulations 20131 as an accredited lab in terms of ISO/IEC 17025 requirements. On their website, it states the ICASA certification is supposed to take 30 days, but really it could take longer at about 10 to 12 weeks. Now let's briefly take a look at an overview of the standard and the simplified type approval processes. Here's a quick overview of the type approval processes. Standard. Register on ICASA database, supplier of equipment, submit applications with all documents. If in compliance, certificate will be approved and granted. Simplified. Supplier must ensure equipment applied for is identical to equipment that is already approved. Does not need test reports, but a sample may be required. All applicants for type approvals are required to register on the ICASA database as a supplier of equipment. Registration will only be afforded to South African registered entities because they are the ones who may obtain the certificate. So, for the standard type approval, you must first register on the ICASA database as a supplier of equipment. Submit the application with all the relevant documents. I will go over these in a few slides. ICASA will go over the documents, and if the product is in compliance with all the regulations, they will issue the certificate. Simplified type approvals is only applicable for products that are identical to already approved products. The supplier must ensure that the equipment applied for is identical to the equipment that is already type approved and appears on the type approved register. You must show proof that the two products are the same. You do not need test reports, but ICASA may require a sample. Here are just a few of the regulated products: wireless, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, SRD, RFID, GSM, WCDMA, LTE, WLAN, UWB, Zigbee, tire pressure sensors, GPS, telecommunications, T1/E1 transmission, ISDN, BRI, ADSL, PSTN, video conference equipment, telephony equipment, satellite equipment, broadcasting equipment, radar. Every telecommunications equipment traded, made, assembled, imported, or used in South African territories is required to comply with the technical regulations. Here is a non-exhaustive list of regulated products for wireless and telecommunications. This is only a small portion of the products that are regulated by ICASA. It covers all wireless devices and RF technologies such as Bluetooth, short-range devices, Zigbee, tire pressure sensors, GPS, satellite equipment, and other technologies. All ICASA certificates are valid indefinitely, but type approvals for fixed line and cellular equipment is valid for only 1 year and is renewable in March every year. Technical requirements. Requirements and standardizations fall under ICASA, which covers EMC/RF, SABS, covers EMC, and NRCS is safety. We just took a look at the products and categories regulated by ICASA. Now we will take a brief look at the EMC and safety regulatory bodies. There are 3 paths we can take here. It does depend on whether or not the product is a radio frequency or telecom product or non-RF/non-telecom device. We will never need all 3 certificates for one device. For radio frequency and telecom products, ICASA covers both radio frequency and EMC certification. ICASA has an understanding with SABS and can certify for EMC along with radio frequency for these types of products. If one of these products also falls under the safety scheme, it will need approval from the NRCS as well. For non-radio frequency and non-telecom products, you may go through SABS or NRCS if applicable. If a product requires ICASA certification, it is usually, if not always, exempt from the SABS process because EMC and low voltage reports, as well as supporting documentation, are provided to ICASA.